For students in our 300 level United States history course, The American Revolution, this video presentation titled Jefferson and Slavery will discuss both sides of the argument in regard to Jefferson and his efforts to end slavery. Following his death and through the mid-20th century, historians have been kind to Jefferson when it comes to his reputation as an opponent of slavery. Historian David Bryan Davis wrote that he was one of the first statesmen in any part of the world to advocate concrete measures for restricting and eradicating Negro slavery. The first major work to question Jefferson's relationship to slavery was Robert Macaulay's 1964 study, Slavery and Jeffersonian Virginia. Macaulay directly acknowledged that he was influenced by the times in which he wrote, which was right in the middle of the Civil Rights Movement. He argued that for much of the 20th century, Jefferson had benefited at the hands of progressive historians. Since then, there have been several historians who have argued that Jefferson's views on slavery changed following the Revolutionary War. Thomas Jefferson was greatly inspired by Enlightenment philosophers John Locke and Baron Montesquieu. Enlightenment thinkers argued that liberty was a natural human right, and that reason and scientific knowledge were responsible for human progress. However, when it comes to the topic of slavery, their views seem contradictory. Although Locke believed that slavery was an authoritarian deprivation of natural rights, he never condemned the institution completely. He felt that slavery was justified if the forced labor was imposed through war. Montesquieu also had contradicting views on the topic. He believed that slavery in its own nature was bad, but went so far to justify it under extreme conditions. Jefferson believed that slavery should be abolished in the new American nation, and that their emancipation would fulfill the idea that all men are created equal. In his original draft of the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson condemned slavery and accused King George III of, and I quote, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery, unquote. The passage was eventually deleted because it would have endangered the unanimous vote needed for the passing of the Declaration of Independence. Many years later, Jefferson would blame the removal of the passage on delegates from South Carolina and Georgia, along with northern delegates who represented merchants who were at the time actively profiting on the transatlantic slave trade. Although the nation's founding document would remain silent on the issue of slavery, some argue that the deleted passage is evidence that Jefferson deplored the institution and was even willing to jeopardize his own livelihood, which was heavily dependent on slave labor. Long before becoming a delegate of the Continental Congress, Jefferson began his quest to end slavery. As a member of Virginia's General Assembly in 1769, Jefferson was able to influence an older member to propose the emancipation of the slaves. Jefferson recorded later in his autobiography that he made one effort for the permission of the emancipation of slaves, which was rejected. In 1774, Jefferson wrote a summary view of the rights of British America, in which he laid out for delegates to the First Continental Congress a set of grievances against King George. This document was the colonists' reply to Parliament's enactment of the Coercive Acts, known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts, which was England's response to the Boston Tea Party. In it, Jefferson included a strong condemnation of slavery in this essay, and he blamed King George for the continuation of the slave trade and the existence of slavery in the American colonies. Jefferson writes that, and I quote, the abolition of domestic slavery is the great object of desire in those colonies where it was unhappily introduced in their infant state, unquote. Jefferson claims that the rights of human nature were deeply wounded by this infamous practice. He writes about equality and argues that all men are equal and therefore should be treated equally. In the last passage, Jefferson contends that liberty and slavery are contradicting when he writes, God who gave us life, gave us liberty at the same time. Between 1774 and 1784, Jefferson was most active on the anti-slavery front, seeking to ban the Atlantic slave trade and prohibit slavery from the western territories of the United States. But after 1784, Jefferson's anti-slavery efforts diminished. In 1785, Jefferson wrote Notes on the State of Virginia, which was a collection of information about the state and an extensive commentary on several topics to include slavery. To read this document today, you could safely say that it reeks of racism. In defense of Jefferson, these racist theories were widespread and considered the science of the time period. As a member of the Virginian upper class, Jefferson was well aware that the economy of Virginia relied heavily on the institution of slavery. As an idealistic Enlightenment thinker, he also knew slavery was morally reprehensible. Jefferson did not call for immediate emancipation, but instead called for a gradual end to slavery so that those in bondage could truly assimilate to freedom. At the end of the 18th century, Jefferson and many other Americans believed that stopping the import of enslaved people from Africa and the Caribbean would hasten the end of slavery. In 1807, 3 weeks before Britain abolished the Atlantic slave trade, President Jefferson signed a law prohibiting the importation of slaves into any port or place within the jurisdiction of the United States. Having established his anti-slavery position, Jefferson revealed his aversion towards the slaves themselves. He claimed that African Americans were as incapable as children of taking care of themselves, and argued that freeing them would lead to racial mixing that would degrade white Americans. Jefferson believed that Negroes were members of a race so different and inferior that there wasn't any hope that whites and blacks could live side by side. In Jefferson's mind, emancipation must be accompanied by the removal of slaves from the country. Although Jefferson understood slavery to be a form of tyranny, the process of removing the black population from America's soil in the post-revolutionary period could not be tyrannical either. He knew that slaves constituted valuable private property, and that the sovereignty of the people also meant the sovereignty of their property. Jefferson believed that federal power could not constitutionally extend into the domestic realm and abolish slavery. Instead, Jefferson proposed a plan to end slavery gradually. After the slave trade was abolished, the slaves would then be ameliorated, meaning the violence of the institution lessened and the living conditions of slaves improved. Then the slaves would be freed in a single large-scale emancipation effort. Finally, slaves would be repatriated to an unspecified country such as Sierra Leone or an island in the West Indies. Thomas Jefferson was aware that he would be judged by posterity over his relationship with slavery. Jefferson sought to present himself in his writings as an opponent of slavery trapped by a system that he inherited and could do little to change. Jefferson attacked slavery, but he also sought to avoid controversy. He was more concerned that future generations rather than his contemporaries should consider him to be an opponent of slavery. Jefferson would save his strongest criticism of slavery for his autobiography, which wasn't published until after his death. In it, Jefferson presented himself as a long-standing opponent of slavery, and some may argue that he did so with an eye on his place in history. It was effective for the most part, as during the 19th century, abolitionists maintained the view that Jefferson was an opponent of slavery. Drawing on the anti-slavery passage from the 1829 four-volume edition of Jefferson's writings, which included the autobiography, slavery's opponents invoked Jefferson's writings to give legitimacy to their cause. Jefferson's carefully constructed image as an opponent of slavery extended well into the 20th century. In 1969, historian William Cohen published a landmark article in the Journal of American History that sought to challenge the traditional view of Jefferson as a would-be emancipationist trapped by an unjust inherited system which he sought to improve by acting as a benevolent master. Jefferson believed himself to be a benevolent master, but in reality he was not. Jefferson, like most slave owners, bought and sold slaves, meted out punishments, and sought to recapture runaways. He was also crueler than previously thought. According to historian Henry Weinsack, in an article written for the Smithsonian Magazine in 2012, a letter had surfaced describing how the young black boys were beaten to get them to work in Jefferson's nail factory. Weinsack claims that the passage was purposely deleted from the published record in the 1953 edition of Thomas Jefferson's Farm Book. Cohen advances the view that the gap between Jefferson's beliefs and actions stemmed from his racism. Jefferson took a number of steps which are explicitly pro-slavery, and his failure to take more substantial action against slavery was a direct result, in part, of his racism. Jefferson grew up in a system that was dependent on slave labor to run the plantations. His own property, spanning 5,000 acres, including Monticello, could not have survived economically without slaves. He developed an extensive organization in which slaves not only worked in the fields and as personal servants, but also ran an industrial complex that included a blacksmith shop, weaver shop, woodworking shop, smokehouse, and a dairy. Cohen argues that as a statesman, Jefferson promoted and protected the spread of slavery in the Southwest, ensuring its survival in Louisiana, and isolating the Haitian Republic, which was established in 1804 by slaves who successfully rebelled against their French masters. Thank you.